What's up guys, Kyle here again, and today we are going to talk about slaving amplifiers. Let's do it! Alright guys, hope you're doing great out there today. If this is your first time here at my channel, my name is Kyle. What I do is I take awesome high gain amps, guitars, cabs, speakers, overdrives, I record them with a simple SM57 setup, and I give you guys the unprocessed audio on your end. So if you're into E-stand or thrash riffs, drop C hardcore riffs, and dudes that get unnaturally excited at the thought of stacking amps 3, 4, and 5 high, you're in the right place. Consider hitting the like button and subscribing on the way out so you don't miss any more of my stuff, like this thing probably falling over on me. Thanks! Alright guys, so today I am going to dive into a subject that a lot of you have asked me to cover in the past, and that is slaving amplifiers. Now what is slaving amplifiers? Because it doesn't sound that great when it hits the ear unless you know what you're talking about. Slaving an amp is taking the preamp of said amplifier and running it into the power section of another amplifier. Now there are a couple of reasons for doing this. Number one, people used to take their amps and slave the preamp out into multiple different power units in order to basically just multiply the amount of power sections that they had for their particular amplifier to get way more volume out of them. Say you're playing like a massive stadium back in the days before, PA systems couldn't really hang all that well and you wanted to just blast your audience. Well, people would take the preamp of their amplifier and essentially run it into a bunch of different power amps and get way more power out of it. Another reason for slaving amplifiers is basically so you can have your preamp of something like, say, your Soldano SLO100 and run it into the power amp of another amp, like say a Mesa Rectifier or a 5150. And yes, I know all these amps are somewhat based off of the SLO100. We're not gonna get into that in this video, but I just wanted to show you how much of a difference a power amp can make in the overall spectrum of your guitar tone, because a lot of people seem to think that if you copy the preamp 100%, much like the early rectifiers of the Soldano SLO100, that it should sound the same. But everybody knows if you've ever played through an SLO100 and you ever played through a Mesa dual rectifier, they sound very, very different. And that is because the power sections on these amps are designed completely differently. So yeah, essentially people would run the preamp out of one amp into the power amp of another in order to use the power amp of the second amp to shape their tone a little bit differently. People used to run preamps out into different tube rack power amps all the time just to get a different flavor of it, whether they were recording or whether they were not. And I'm pretty sure that there are ways that you can do it for a wet, dry, wet type of signal as well. I don't really know how to do that, so I'm not gonna touch on it because I'm not much of an effects guy, but I'm basically just going to show you how to do it and how much of a difference it can make in your sound, slaving one preamp into another power amp, because I think you're gonna be surprised at how much of a difference you're gonna hear. All right guys, so we are on the back of the amplifiers now, and I'm gonna show you how to hook these up in order to properly slave the preamp out of the SLO100 into another amp. So on the back here, you see your back panel, you've got a line out. Now what this is this is a line out from the preamp section that you can take and put it directly into the power section of something else or an external power amp, whatever you wanna do. So you're just gonna take a regular instrument cable, plug it into the line out, and then whatever you're plugging it into, I think the mailman's here because my dogs are going nuts right now. So you're gonna take that line out cable and you are going to plug it into the effects return of whatever amp that it is you're slaving the preamp into. So in this case, if we're going into the rectifier, we're gonna go in right here to the effects return. Boom, so now your preamp out of your SLO100 is now running into the effects return or the power section return of the Mesa dual rectifier. One thing that you have to keep in mind though, guys, is if you are only using the SLO for its preamp and you are not going to be running the amp into its own dedicated cabinet, you are going to need a load box or a reactive load or something to put a load on the power section of the SLO100, because if you do not, you're gonna blow up the output section of your SLO100, and that is going to be a very, very expensive mistake, and that goes for any of these other amps. All three of these amps technically have line outs for the preamp, but if you use that line out and you don't have whatever amp that it is that you're running the line out of hooked into its own speaker cabinet, you have to make sure that it has some sort of load on the power section via a reactive load or a load box of some sort in order to keep from damaging the power section of that amp. But yeah, it's that simple, guys. That's all there is to it. You're gonna plug the guitar into the front of the SLO100. You're gonna plug the line out into the effects return of the Mesa Boogie dual rectifier. And if you are not plugging this amp into a cab, you are going to have a reactive load on this amp, and then you are going to run your speaker cable from the Mesa Boogie dual rectifier into the cabinet in order to get all of your tonal goodness. Okay guys, so now that we know how to slave amplifiers together, what I'm gonna do, I'm going to play the Soldano SLO100 on its own, and then I'm going to run the power section of the SLO100 into our 2-notes captor up here in order to basically soak up the power out of the Soldano. That way we don't blow our amp up while we are slaving it into these other 2 amps here. And then I will obviously run the preamp of the Soldano into the power amp of the Mesa, and then into the power amp of the Peavey 5150 to show you guys the differences in the tones that the power amps can create. So here is the SLO100 running through its own power section. This is basically just what you would hear when you plug into an SLO100. Should have warmed up before this video. But yeah, that is the SLO100 by itself. Now we are going to take the preamp out of the SLO100, run it into the power amp of the Mesa Boogie dual rectifier, Rev G, and see how it sounds doing that. I don't know why I struggle with that sentence so bad. All right, guys, here is how that sounds. It is extremely bright. It has a lot less low end and does not sound very pleasant. So, all right, so we reduced the treble on here, and surprisingly, the presence and the depth both work on the line out of the SLO100. So you're getting the effects of those as well. So I dialed the presence way back. And yeah, that's all that I did as far as the SLO is concerned. And then on the dual rectifier, the only thing that's gonna work on this amp when you are slaving a preamp into it is your loop active master volume. So I basically just matched the volume levels using that control, and here's what we have. So we have a much brighter, much more modern voicing. A lot of the mids that were present in the SLO100 are kind of missing in the power amp of the rectifier. And I feel like the power amp of the rectifier sounds much thinner overall. So I'm gonna boost the bass pretty much all the way. I'm gonna add a little bit of mid, and I'm gonna take out some treble. And it is still real bright, so let's pull some presence back out on the SLO, and let's add a little bit more deep from the deep control and see if we can kind of fatten it up a little bit. Now that is sounding much more balanced to my ears. It sounds pretty good as we have it dialed in. So, same riff now. All right, so overall, I feel like There is more top end, there is less mids, there is less low end for sure. We really had to push the low end on the preamp of the Soldano going into the rectifier in order to make it fill out and sound fuller. I still think the SLO power amp sounds fuller on its own. I do like where the high end and the brightness are on the rectifier once you adjust the Soldano. I think it sounds a little bit more modern, a little bit more biting to my taste, whereas the SLO is a little bit smoother. So pros and cons to each in my personal opinion. Let me know what you guys think about the tones down in the comments. We'll move over to the 5150 and check that out now and see how that differs. All right, so I have touched nothing on the SLO 100 and we are going into the power amp of the 5150, and this is basically how I would have the power amp set if I was playing the 5150 on its own. So let's see what kind of tones we get. All right, so we have way more low end and we have way less top end. So the power amp section, even with the presence as high as I have it set on the 5150, is nowhere near as bright as the power section on the dual rectifier. So that I find that really interesting, actually. I didn't realize there was that much of a difference there. But let's go ahead and dial up the treble and the presence and try to get some of that brightness back in our signal on the SLO. All right, maybe a little bit more. All right, let's also bring the bass back and the depth back a little bit on the SLO. All right, so we definitely have a ton of low end in the 5150 power section. There's no doubt about that. I'm gonna pull the bass back even more and the depth back even more on the SLO 100. All right, finally, that riff one more time. All right, guys, so now you see the differences between the power amps of these three amps and why slaving can make a massive difference in your overall tone. 5150 definitely had a lot less top end and a lot more low end in the power section of it inherently than the SLO. And then on the rectifier was pretty much the exact opposite. The rectifier had way more top end, like it was insanely bright on top, and it had a lot less low end fullness in the power section. It just sounded smaller overall. And then, you know, the SLO 100 was kind of like a little bit in between the two. It had a decent amount of low end, had a decent amount of top end. I felt the power section of the SLO 100 was the most clear for sure. If I had to pick a favorite, I would say I liked the power section of the 5150 the most, although I do feel like it did lack a little bit of clarity, and I think that's due to the high end being reduced. There's obviously a lot of high end in the 5150 preamp signal. I really liked the bite that the Mesa had once you kind of dialed everything in to account for the differences in the power section of the rectifier and the Soldano SLO. It was tight enough in my opinion. The SLO power section is definitely the loosest of all three and the smoothest sounding. So yeah, three different tones, all from the same preamp. It depends on what power amp you put them into. And that's why you can utilize amp slaving, especially if you're in a studio situation. If you really want to change the tone of your amp and kind of, you know, have it take on characteristics of another without kind of losing its identity, then slaving it into a different power amp is definitely one way to do that. I think this was a really fun video, really interesting experiment, and hopefully you guys learned a little bit from it. If you did, do me a favor, hit that like button on the way out, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any more ridiculous stuff like this. I'm pretty sure I'm deaf after this video because we definitely had these power sections cranking really high in order to show the differences, but it was a lot of fun for me. I really enjoyed it. So if you guys want to support what I do here, down in the description of this video are all my support links, including my Sweetwater affiliate link. You click that link, you click a slink. Click that link, get yourself something nice from the fine folks at Sweetwater. I get a little kickback, it costs you nothing extra. Everybody wins. It'd be really cool if you did it. Or you can consider adding your name to this list of fine people. I'm pretty sure that my camera is tilted to the left now that I look at it. But anyways, consider becoming a member of my Patreon community, adding your name to this list of people. I would really very much appreciate it. I take that money and I put it into more gear for the channel here, so that's just another way to help me do what I'm doing. And if you do it, you get the added bonus effect of me loving you forever, whether you want me to or not. Last but not least, check out my Facebook group as well down below in the description, where we talk about gear all day long. It's a really great community, not toxic at all like a lot of the other Facebook guitar groups, and we're gonna keep it that way. So feel free to head on over, join that Facebook group. I'd love to see you guys there. Thanks so much for watching. Kyle here again. We'll see you next time.